The town was quiet that morning. The sun had just started spilling golden light over the streets, touching the rooftops and the small market stalls. Birds chirped lazily and a soft breeze moved through the narrow alleys. People were beginning their day, unaware that life as they knew it was about to change. Among them was a local shopkeeper who was sweeping the steps outside his small store. He paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. It felt different today, heavier somehow. There was no sound of the usual laughter of children running to school, just the occasional clatter of a cart and the distant barking of a dog. He shook his head, thinking he was imagining things, and returned to his work. A little further down the street, a young teacher was walking to the school, carrying a bundle of books. She noticed a group of children playing near the fountain, their laughter echoing faintly. But even in their play, something seemed off. The fountain's water had a strange murky color, and the children kept splashing carefully as if they knew something was wrong but didn't fully understand what it was. The teacher frowned and quickened her pace, worried about what the day might bring. In the center of town, an older man was opening the small medical clinic he had run for decades. He had seen many emergencies before, but a certain unease lingered in his chest that morning. He noticed the radio in the corner was crackling more than usual, as if trying to warn him of something he could not yet hear clearly. He turned the knob, but only faint static filled the room. Still, he felt an instinctive pull to prepare just in case. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. People moved about, carrying on with daily life. But there were whispers in the markets and cafes. Some talked about unusual weather patterns, while others mentioned that neighboring villages had seen strange occurrences overnight. No one fully understood it, and yet everyone felt it. A quiet tension, like the calm before a storm. As the morning passed, a young delivery worker was riding his bicycle through the narrow streets, delivering bread and other supplies. He noticed the clouds forming in the sky were darker than usual, and the wind had grown sharper. He slowed down, gripping the handlebars tightly. The usual route felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. When he passed the river at the edge of town, he saw the water moving faster than he had ever seen it before, frothing over the banks with an unusual force. A chill ran down his spine. Back in the town square, an old woman was setting up her small fruit stall. She had lived through many storms and crises, but today she found herself pausing, staring at the sky with a worried frown. The birds that usually perched nearby were gone, and even the air felt heavier, almost charged. She muttered a quiet prayer under her breath and shook her head, hoping it was nothing serious. Even as life went on, small signs were appearing everywhere. A neighbor noticed cracks forming in the walls of his house. Another saw the local bridge shudder slightly under the weight of a cart passing by. The town's animals acted strangely too. Dogs barked at nothing, and cows refused to move from their pens. For most people, these were just small curiosities easily ignored. But for some, there was a creeping sense that something bigger was about to happen. Something that would demand attention, courage, and action. By midday, the atmosphere had shifted. The sky darkened, not fully with clouds, but with a strange, ominous haze. Conversations in the market had become quieter, more urgent. People exchanged concerned glances, their laughter gone. The shopkeeper had stopped sweeping and was now listening intently to the radio, hoping for any news. The teacher had gathered the children closer to the school, her heart pounding as she thought about what might happen if the day continued this way. It was in this ordinary, yet quietly tense morning that the first whispers of danger truly reached the town. Far away, in places the townspeople had never seen, events were unfolding that would ripple outward, touching every life in the small town. For now, it remained hidden behind the hum of daily life. But the seeds of a coming crisis had been planted, and those seeds were about to grow fast. The townspeople went about their routines, unaware of how quickly everything could change. Yet, even in the quiet, a few felt a strange pull, an instinctive understanding that they could not ignore. Something was coming, something that would challenge their courage, test their compassion, and demand action in ways they could never have imagined. By late afternoon, a few first signs became impossible to ignore. Water levels in the river were rising unnaturally fast. Winds carried strange debris across the streets, and the birds, sensing danger, had abandoned the skies entirely. The shopkeeper looked at the river nervously, and for the first time he whispered aloud, "We need to be ready." The teacher gathered her students at school, holding them close, trying to remain calm while her own heart raced. The old woman at the fruit stall closed her stand early, hurrying home to check on her neighbors and loved ones. Even the delivery worker, who had been moving swiftly all day, slowed down, looking around with an uneasy feeling that today was not going to end as it began. As evening approached, the town seemed to hold its breath again. Shadows stretched across the streets, and the wind carried an uneasy howl through the alleys. It was in that quiet, tense moment that the first whispers of what was to come began to take shape, spreading fear, confusion, and a hint of determination. No one in the town knew yet that their lives were about to change forever. But even in their ordinary routines, in the small gestures of care for each other, there were the first glimmers of the courage and humanity that would soon be tested. And when the crisis finally arrived, every small act of awareness, every instinctive decision to prepare, would matter more than they could imagine. The calm of that morning and the subtle signs of change were the first chapter in a story that would push every person in the town to their limits, showing both the fragility and the strength of human life. By the next morning, the quiet unease that had settled over the town the day before had grown heavier. The river that skirted the edge of the town was no longer just moving fast. It had begun to overflow, spilling onto the narrow streets. Water lapped at the edges of homes and shops, carrying debris from upstream. The shopkeeper who had swept the steps just yesterday now stood at the doorway of his store, gripping the railing as the cold water crept closer. His heart pounded, and for the first time, fear settled deep inside him. From the school, the teacher looked out at the swelling river. Children clung to her hands, their small faces pale and unsure. The sky was a strange shade of gray, and the clouds above moved with unusual speed as if pushed by an invisible hand. The wind picked up suddenly, tugging at clothing and loose branches, and the teacher's stomach twisted with worry. She knew she had to keep calm, even though every instinct screamed that danger was near. In the market square, the old woman who ran the fruit stall hurried to secure her small shop. She had seen storms before, but this was different. The water was moving too quickly, and the air smelled of something unfamiliar, almost metallic. She called out to neighbors, helping them move what belongings they could to higher ground. There was no time for panic, only action. Even as fear gripped them, people began to step up, reaching out to each other in the small, quiet ways that mattered most. The wind and water were not the only threats. Reports began to spread of trees falling across roads and small landslides on the hills surrounding the town. A delivery worker who had once pedaled quickly through the streets with bread and parcels now moved cautiously, helping push a cart that had tipped into a puddle. Every street seemed to present a new obstacle, a new danger. Yet in every corner of the town, people were looking out for each other, guiding those who were confused or too afraid to move. By late morning, the full scale of the disaster became visible. The river had flooded the main street, the water rising up to knee-height in some places. Shops and homes were damaged, and the cries of frightened children echoed through the narrow lanes. Families clung to each other, moving carefully through the flood, unsure where to go. Even as fear spread, moments of courage and humanity shone through. A man carried an elderly neighbor through the rising water. A young girl helped a smaller child climb onto higher steps. Strangers reached out to help each other across the streets, forming temporary chains of solidarity. The old man who ran the clinic moved quickly, opening doors to shelter those trapped by the flood. The first injured began to arrive, cuts from broken glass, bruises from falling debris, and the exhaustion of running from water and wind. He worked tirelessly, calling for calm while treating each person as if they were his own family. People around him began to assist, bringing clean water, blankets, and whatever supplies they could find. It was chaos, yet in that chaos the best of humanity emerged. Even as people helped, danger continued to grow. The sky darkened further, turning a deep, threatening gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance and lightning flashed across the clouds. Rain began to fall in sheets, cold and relentless, adding to the rising water and battering the already soaked town. The shopkeeper had gathered what little belongings he could save and now joined a group carrying supplies to the school, which had become a temporary shelter. The teacher guided the children inside, wrapping them in spare blankets and trying to keep their spirits calm despite the noise and fear outside. Amid the storm, small stories of bravery emerged. A young man waded through chest-deep water to rescue a dog trapped near the riverbank. A mother held her baby above the water while calling to neighbors for help. Even those who had never considered themselves heroes found themselves acting with courage, instinctively putting others before themselves. Fear was everywhere, but so was compassion. Every act, no matter how small, became a lifeline for someone in need. By afternoon, the disaster had spread to nearly every corner of the town. Power lines were down, communication was difficult, and many streets were impassable. The old woman from the fruit stall was now helping deliver food to families stranded in their homes. The delivery worker guided people to safer routes, pointing out hazards in the water. The teacher and the shopkeeper coordinated with each other, setting up areas in the school and town hall where people could stay dry and receive aid. In the midst of the chaos, fear sometimes gave way to frustration. Some people shouted at the situation, at the water, at the storm. Others fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the force of nature. Yet even in these moments, the sense of community remained. Strangers offered comforting words, shared their supplies, and reassured one another that help would come. It was not a perfect response, but it was real, human, and alive. As evening approached, the flood showed no signs of stopping. The town that had been quiet and calm just a day ago was now filled with the sounds of rushing water, shouting, crying, and the occasional laughter of relief when a rescue succeeded. The sky, streaked with lightning, illuminated the determination etched on the faces of those helping each other. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest resident, was touched by the disaster, but every person also found a spark of courage and resilience inside themselves. That night, as the storm continued, the town finally began to settle into what small comfort it could. People huddled together in schools, clinics, and shelters, sharing warmth and stories to distract from the fear outside. The shopkeeper kept watch over the main road, ensuring that no one was left alone. The teacher held the children close, singing softly to calm them. The old woman checked on her neighbors, making sure everyone had something to eat. Even as the water rose and the storm raged on, a sense of unity began to grow. People realized that this disaster was larger than any one person, but together they could face it. The human spirit, tested in fear and hardship, began to shine through the darkness. They had no control over the storm, but they had control over how they treated each other, and that made all the difference. By the time night fully fell, the town was soaked, tired and frightened, but still alive. Every small act of courage, every hand stretched to help another, had kept them going. The disaster was far from over, but the people had shown that even in the face of sudden chaos, humanity could respond with bravery, care, and determination. The first wave of the storm had passed, but the lessons of the day were clear. Fear could not be ignored, danger could not be denied, but the strength of community, the instinct to help, and the courage to act could carry them through anything. And deep in the hearts of every person who had faced the flood that day, a quiet hope was growing, that no matter what came next, they would not face it alone. The morning after the flood, the town was still reeling from the chaos of the previous day. The streets were muddy and littered with broken branches, debris, and the remnants of belongings that could not be saved. Water still lingered in low areas, forming puddles and small streams that carried the smell of earth and rain. People moved slowly, tired from sleepless nights, but determined to help each other rebuild whatever they could. The teacher had spent the night comforting the children and keeping them calm in the makeshift shelter at the school. She was exhausted, but the worry in her eyes did not fade. She had already seen what the flood could do, and she knew it was not over yet. She looked around the room and saw the children holding tightly to blankets, listening to the adults quietly talking about what to do next. The fear in their eyes was real, but so was their trust in the adults around them. The shopkeeper stepped outside to survey the town. His own store had been damaged, but that seemed small compared to the struggles of others. He watched neighbors wade carefully through the remaining water, carrying what they could save from their homes. Even in exhaustion, the town was alive with acts of kindness, people helping the elderly across streets, sharing food, and checking on those who had no one else to help them. The community had begun to act as one, but the challenge was far beyond what they could manage alone. It was then that the first message went out beyond the town. A local radio operator, who had managed to keep his equipment running through the storm, sent an urgent broadcast describing the flood, the rising water, and the immediate needs of the people. His voice was calm but serious, explaining that the town required help quickly. food, medical supplies, rescue teams, and volunteers. The call was simple, but it carried the weight of desperation. The message traveled farther than anyone could have imagined. Outside the town, in nearby cities, and even distant regions, the radio broadcast was heard. Social media accounts picked it up, sharing photos and stories sent by those still trapped in the flood. People who had never been to the town before felt a strong pull to act. They shared the message, donated supplies, and organized teams ready to leave at a moment's notice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Meanwhile, inside the town, the old man running the clinic realized that they could not manage alone. The injured were growing in number, supplies were limited, and the buildings that had been used as temporary shelters were at risk from the continuing rain. He, along with the shopkeeper and the teacher, began coordinating the locals, preparing for the arrival of outside help. They set up lists of who needed food, who required medical attention, and which families were still trapped in areas cut off by the floodwaters. Every person had a role, and everyone tried to do their best despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on their shoulders. By midday, the first signs of help arrived. A small convoy of vehicles carrying relief supplies made it through a partially cleared road. People ran toward the trucks, helping to unload sacks of rice, bottles of clean water, and blankets. The relief workers moved quickly, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency, but they were careful not to overwhelm the frightened townspeople. The sense of urgency was palpable, but so was the humanity in every interaction. Volunteers guided families to safe spots, carried children who could not walk through the water, and offered words of comfort to those who had lost everything. Stories began to emerge that reflected both the hardship and the courage of the town. The teacher helped a child find a lost pet, and the joy of that small reunion brought a fleeting smile to everyone around. The shopkeeper worked alongside volunteers to repair the worst damaged parts of the market, and even in the mud and rain, neighbors laughed as they shared the hard work. The old woman from the fruit stall carried blankets to families who had spent the night in cold, damp homes. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced a sense of hope. Even as relief arrived, the townspeople faced new challenges. Some areas were still inaccessible, and the heavy rains threatened to worsen the flood. Roads were blocked, bridges weakened, and communication remained limited. Volunteers had to move carefully, balancing the urgency of rescue with the safety of everyone involved. Still, every difficulty brought out more courage and determination. People who had felt helpless yesterday were now leaders in their own right, guiding outsiders, sharing knowledge of the streets, and making sure no one was left behind. By late afternoon, the flood's initial fury had passed, but the work of recovery had only just begun. Relief workers, alongside local residents, continued to bring in supplies and help families reach safer areas. The teacher, shopkeeper, and clinic operator worked tirelessly, coordinating teams, keeping records, and making sure everyone had what they needed. Their voices were hoarse from calling out instructions, but their hearts were strengthened by the cooperation and gratitude they saw everywhere. News crews began arriving in the town as well, capturing images and stories of the disaster and the response. Though some residents were wary of the attention, many realized that the wider the story spread, the more help could reach them. Outside donations increased, more volunteers prepared to travel, and supplies were sent from cities and even neighboring regions. The initial call for aid had transformed into a movement, a wave of support that the town could never have imagined when the storm first hit. Even in the midst of relief, the human side of the story remained at the center. Volunteers shared meals with residents, comforted children, and listened to stories of loss and survival. The old man at the clinic tended to patients with care, never rushing, making sure that each person felt seen and supported. The shopkeeper handed out supplies personally, greeting everyone with a smile even when his own hands were tired. The teacher comforted children who had lost toys, friends, or homes, reminding them that they were safe for now and that people cared. As evening fell, the town felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Though the floodwaters were still high in some areas, the arrival of aid and the efforts of the townspeople had already made a noticeable difference. Families who had been trapped were now in shelters. Injured individuals were receiving treatment. Food and clean water were reaching those who needed it most. And through it all, the people of the town had begun to understand something important. Even in the face of overwhelming disaster, humanity could respond with determination, care, and solidarity. By night, the town was quieter than it had been in the chaos of the previous days. But the energy of recovery remained. Lights shone from the temporary shelters, and the sound of people talking, laughing, and sharing their experiences filled the air. Volunteers and townspeople alike felt a sense of accomplishment and connection. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear together, and now they were stronger for it. The call for aid had been answered, but it was only the beginning. The disaster had exposed vulnerabilities, shown the fragility of life, and revealed the strength of human spirit. In the days to come, more challenges would arrive, more storms, more obstacles. But the town had learned that when humanity responds, even the most difficult circumstances can be met with courage, compassion, and hope. And as the night deepened, the people of the town finally allowed themselves to rest, knowing that they were no longer facing the disaster alone. Help had come, hope had arrived, and in the quiet moments before sleep, a new sense of determination and resilience began to grow. The story of this town was far from over, but the first step toward recovery had been taken, and it had been taken together. By the morning of the fourth day, the town was no longer simply surviving. It was moving toward recovery, and the full weight of human effort had begun to show. Volunteers from nearby regions and even distant cities had arrived, bringing with them food, clean water, medicine, and tools. People who had watched the disaster unfold from afar were now standing in the flooded streets, working side by side with the townspeople, their hands muddy, their clothes soaked, but their determination unwavering. The teacher had organized the children into small groups, helping them distribute supplies to families who were still trapped in their homes. Each child carried what they could manage. Some brought blankets, others carried water bottles, and some simply held the hands of those who were frightened. The children laughed quietly as they worked, finding small moments of joy in the midst of hardship. Even the youngest seemed to understand that every action mattered, and that helping others was a way to take back control in a world that had felt so chaotic just days before. At the market square, the shopkeeper joined a team of volunteers working to clear debris. Fallen branches, broken signs, and mud blocked the main street, slowing down the delivery of supplies. Yet the team worked tirelessly, moving stones and logs, handing buckets of water from one person to the next, and ensuring that everyone could pass safely. Their work was exhausting, but no one complained. Every person knew that their effort would allow families to reach safety, or allow food to reach those who had gone hungry. The old woman who ran the fruit stall had become a central figure in the coordination of aid. She had an extraordinary way of keeping track of who needed what, remembering faces and names even in the chaos. Families who had lost everything came to her first, knowing that she could direct them to food, water, and medical help. Even volunteers, unfamiliar with the town, learned to follow her guidance, trusting her deep knowledge of the streets, the people, and the dangers that remained. Throughout the day, small acts of bravery and humanity emerged, quietly but powerfully. A young man waded into water nearly chest-high to save an elderly couple trapped by a fallen tree. Two neighbors worked together to carry a family's belongings from a damaged home to the school-turned-shelter. A volunteer medic calmly treated a child with a deep cut, comforting the frightened little one with soft words while the child's parents watched, relieved and grateful. Every story, every gesture, reminded everyone that in the worst moments, courage and compassion could rise naturally, even in people who had never considered themselves heroes. By midday, teams had begun to reach the more isolated areas of the town. Flooded streets and damaged bridges made access difficult, but volunteers and locals worked together, forming human chains to carry supplies and guide those in need to safety. The river, though still swollen, no longer seemed entirely like an enemy. It had forced people to cooperate, to communicate, and to look out for one another in ways they might never have done before. The clinic was now a hub of activity. The old man who ran it worked alongside volunteer doctors and nurses, treating injuries, checking on the elderly, and providing advice on preventing illness from contaminated water. Patients were nervous, exhausted, and scared. Yet the calm professionalism of the medics, combined with the familiarity of the town's own residents, brought comfort. Families who had feared the worst were now finding relief, not just in treatment, but in the presence of people who genuinely cared. At the school, the teacher continued to oversee the shelter for children and families. She had organized games and small activities to distract the children, but also to teach them about safety during the ongoing flood. Small lessons about washing hands, staying in groups, and helping others were combined with songs, stories, and laughter. The children's faces, once filled with fear, now showed sparks of hope. Even in a disaster, human connection had a way of shining through. By mid-afternoon, the town began to look different. Streets were being cleared, supplies were reaching, families and injured or frightened individuals were receiving care. The shopkeeper, the teacher, and the old woman moved through the town constantly, checking on volunteers, encouraging locals, and ensuring that help reached every corner. Every interaction, no matter how small, reminded people that they were not alone, and that the human spirit was stronger than the water, the mud, and the fear that had threatened to overwhelm them. The stories of courage continued to multiply. A volunteer lifted a young child from the water, calming the frightened little one while reuniting them with their parent. A group of townspeople and volunteers guided a stranded cow to higher ground, knowing that animals were also part of the community's life. A mother shared her meager food rations with a family who had none, refusing to let them go hungry even when her own children were still hungry. Every act of care, no matter how small, created ripples that strengthened the community and built trust among people who had never met before. As evening approached, the town felt a growing sense of relief. Even though the flood was far from fully controlled, the volunteers were exhausted, but they remained steadfast, coordinating with locals to plan for the night. Families settled into the school community hall and other makeshift shelters. People shared meals, blankets, and stories, creating a sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation. Even in exhaustion, smiles and laughter returned, small but powerful signs that humanity was responding with strength and warmth. In a quiet corner of the shelter, the teacher observed the children as they talked softly among themselves. She realized that despite the danger, the fear, and the exhaustion, they had learned something important. When people come together, they can survive almost anything. In the market square, the shopkeeper paused for a moment, watching volunteers and locals work together, realizing that this disaster had uncovered the best in everyone: the bravery, the compassion, and the willingness to help even strangers in need. Night fell, but the town was no longer silent. The sounds of teamwork, quiet conversation, and careful laughter filled the air. People moved in and out of shelters, volunteers checked on families, and the injured were cared for. The flood had forced humanity into action, and it was now responding with all its energy, creativity, and care. Every person in the town, whether a resident or a volunteer, was part of this response. Every action mattered. By the end of the fourth day, it was clear that while the flood had brought destruction, it had also brought out the best in people. Strangers had become friends, communities had become stronger, and acts of courage and compassion had multiplied. The disaster had shown that humanity could respond not just with efficiency, but with heart. It had reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, people could rise together, helping each other to survive, recover, and even find moments of hope and joy. Even as the town prepared to rest for the night, there was an unspoken understanding that the days ahead would still be difficult. Yet the spirit of cooperation, the courage in every small act, and the shared humanity of those facing the disaster had already created a foundation that nothing, not even water and mud, could wash away. The flood was not over, and challenges would continue to come. But the town had discovered a truth that would carry it forward. When humanity responds fully, with care, courage, and determination, it can meet any challenge. And in that response, no one is ever truly alone. By the fifth day, the initial wave of relief had made a noticeable difference, but new challenges began to test the patience and determination of everyone in the town. Roads that had been partially cleared were blocked again by mudslides and fallen trees. Some areas remained completely unreachable, leaving families stranded and supplies delayed. Even as volunteers and locals worked tirelessly, it became clear that the flood was far from over, and the work of recovery would be far harder than anyone had imagined. The shopkeeper stood in the middle of the main street, surveying the damage and the chaos. His store had been partially repaired, but the water had returned overnight, ruining much of the effort. Volunteers shouted across the street, trying to coordinate teams for clearing debris. But the rising frustration was visible on everyone's faces. Tension was high, and even the kindest, most patient people found themselves snapping at each other, not out of malice, but because the pressure was unbearable. In the shelter at the school, the teacher tried to calm a group of children who were restless and anxious. The continuous rain and the noise of the flood made it difficult to keep them occupied. Some parents were worried and angry, venting their frustrations on the volunteers and on each other. There were moments of shouting, tears, and despair, and the teacher felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had to remain calm, but inside she too was exhausted and frustrated. Even the volunteers were feeling the strain. Some had traveled for hours to reach the town, only to find the conditions worse than they had imagined. Equipment was limited, roads were blocked, and coordination was difficult. Tensions rose as small disagreements turned into arguments over priorities: who to help first, which areas to reach, and how to manage the growing number of people needing aid. The situation demanded patience, but the combination of fatigue, fear, and desperation tested even the most experienced volunteers. At the clinic, the old man who ran it worked long hours without rest. Supplies were running low, and more injured people were arriving than he could treat immediately. Patients grew frustrated, families became anxious, and the constant pressure made mistakes more likely. Despite the exhaustion, he continued to work, his calm voice cutting through the panic as he tried to keep order. He knew that anger and frustration were natural reactions, but they could also hinder recovery, so he did his best to guide people toward cooperation instead of conflict. Meanwhile, some families became desperate. The flood had destroyed homes, food was limited in some areas, and communication with the outside world was still spotty. People shouted at passing volunteers, demanding faster assistance or questioning why help had not yet reached their street. Others argued with neighbors over shared supplies, afraid that if they did not act quickly, they would go hungry or lose what little they had saved. The tension was palpable, but even in anger, people helped one another when it mattered most, showing that fear could coexist with compassion. Outside, teams of volunteers faced natural obstacles that made their work nearly impossible at times. Roads were flooded, landslides blocked pathways, and bridges were too weak to support heavy loads of supplies. Each attempt to reach a stranded family felt like a battle against the elements. Some volunteers fell, getting soaked or injured, while others risked crossing dangerous paths to deliver food or carry people to safety. The combination of urgency and danger created a sense of fury, anger at the situation, at the flood, at the obstacles that seemed never-ending. In the town square, the shopkeeper and volunteers tried to organize the delivery of supplies, but arguments broke out over logistics. Some volunteers wanted to focus on clearing roads first, while others insisted on taking food to those waiting at the far edges of town. People who were hungry, scared, and exhausted voiced their frustrations loudly, sometimes creating tension between those who were supposed to be working together. It was a reminder that even with the best intentions, disasters could strain the patience and cooperation of everyone involved. Despite these moments of frustration, acts of courage and humanity continued to emerge. A young man helped calm an elderly woman who was panicking, talking to her gently as he carried her to safety. Two neighbors argued about the best way to carry supplies, then quickly agreed to combine their efforts, laughing at their own stubbornness. Even in anger and exhaustion, people found ways to work together, showing that human spirit often grows stronger when tested. The rain continued without mercy, making recovery slower and more exhausting. People slept only in short bursts, if at all, and fatigue made tempers shorter. Volunteers shared water and food, trying to remind everyone to take care of themselves, but it was clear that the flood had pushed everyone to their limits. Yet in these moments of fury and frustration, the strength of the town was becoming visible. Residents who had never led a group before now organized teams, directed volunteers, and reassured frightened neighbors. Ordinary people were performing extraordinary acts of leadership. By late afternoon, a particularly difficult stretch of road had blocked access to a cluster of homes that were now entirely cut off. Volunteers and locals argued over the best way to clear it. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the urgency of reaching stranded families heightened tempers. Yet even in the argument, people listened to one another, weighed each idea, and eventually agreed on a plan. Slowly, they began to move, combining their energy to achieve what no one could have done alone. The frustration had not disappeared, but it had become fuel for action rather than a force that could divide them. Even children felt the weight of tension, noticing the anger in adults' voices. But they also saw the acts of bravery and cooperation, learning that frustration is natural but can be managed, and that when humans respond together, they can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. In quiet moments, children held hands and offered comforting words to neighbors, mirroring the courage they saw in the adults around them. As evening came, the town was battered, tired, and still dealing with the floodwaters, but a sense of resolve had taken hold. The fury of the situation, the storm, its delays, its destroyed homes remained, but it had been transformed into determination. People were working longer hours, moving more carefully, and coordinating more efficiently. Volunteers and residents alike understood that the path to recovery was messy, frustrating, and exhausting, but it was possible because they faced it together. By night, the town was quiet in a new way. The anger and frustration of the day had given way to reflection and exhaustion. Families huddled in shelters. Volunteers checked their lists and supplies, and leaders among the townspeople considered what needed to happen tomorrow. Despite setbacks, delays, and the natural fury of both the flood and human emotion, one truth had become clear. Humanity could endure difficulty, overcome frustration, and still act with courage and compassion. The flood had tested their limits, but it had also revealed their strength. People had experienced fear, anger, and despair, but they had also found hope, solidarity, and the power to act. And as the night deepened, the town slept fitfully, knowing that challenges remained, but that they would meet them together with determination born from both fury and compassion. The days following the flood were quieter than the first chaotic mornings, but the work of recovery had only just begun. Streets were muddy, houses were damaged, and the river, though calmer, still reminded the town of its recent fury. Yet amid the destruction, a new energy had settled over the town. People were tired, yes, but they were also determined. They had faced fear, chaos, and anger, and had survived together. Now the challenge was to rebuild, not just their homes, but the sense of normalcy and safety that had been lost. The shopkeeper went through the market, checking on neighbors and helping distribute the remaining supplies. Many people had lost much, but the community spirit was alive. Families shared what little they had saved. Neighbors lent a helping hand to repair broken doors and windows, and volunteers continued to coordinate aid with remarkable patience. The sense of unity was stronger than any fear or exhaustion, and it was visible in the small gestures of care throughout the town. At the school, which had served as a temporary shelter, the teacher guided children back to some semblance of routine. Lessons resumed, though, in makeshift classrooms or even outdoors under tents. Children laughed again, their voices carrying across the town like a reminder that life would continue. The teacher organized small activities to help them process the trauma they had experienced. Storytelling, drawing, and group discussions allowed children to express their fear and hope, while also teaching them resilience and the importance of helping one another. The old woman who had run the fruit stall now coordinated community kitchens, making sure every family received food. Her energy seemed limitless, and her ability to remember who needed what became crucial in the weeks following the flood. Volunteers looked to her for guidance, and even the locals who had relied on her for supplies before the disaster admired how she now led efforts to rebuild their community. Small acts of kindness, from giving blankets to comforting children, became the backbone of the town's recovery. The clinic remained a central hub, but now it also focused on long-term care. Doctors and nurses treated injuries that had worsened over the days, checked for waterborne illnesses, and offered guidance on rebuilding homes safely. The old man who ran the clinic worked tirelessly, but he was no longer alone. Volunteers from other towns and cities had stayed on, committed to helping the community recover fully. Patients were grateful, and even in exhaustion, smiles returned. Each healed injury and reassured family became a small victory, a sign that life was returning step by step. Rebuilding the town required patience. Roads that had been washed away had to be repaired. Bridges needed reinforcement. Homes had to be cleaned, repaired, or in some cases completely rebuilt. Yet the people worked together, learning to rely not just on external aid but on one another. Neighbors who had barely spoken before the flood now formed teams, sharing skills, tools, and labor. Every repaired roof, Every cleared street and every restored home became a symbol of resilience. Amid the work, moments of reflection began to appear. People talked quietly about what had happened, sharing their fears and the small acts of courage that had carried them through the worst moments. A mother spoke of how a neighbor had carried her children to safety. A young man remembered how volunteers had saved a stray dog trapped in the floodwaters. These stories, shared at community gatherings or over simple meals, strengthened bonds and reminded everyone of the value of compassion and solidarity. Even the natural world seemed to be healing. The river's waters receded gradually, leaving behind fertile soil and a new perspective on its power. Trees that had been uprooted were collected and repurposed, while areas damaged by mudslides were cleared carefully. People learned to respect the strength of nature, while also taking steps to protect themselves and their homes from future disasters. Lessons about preparedness, cooperation, and vigilance became part of the community's shared knowledge. As the weeks passed, a sense of pride grew. The town was not just surviving, it was recovering. Children returned to school regularly, families began to rebuild their homes, and businesses slowly reopened. The shopkeeper's store, though smaller than before, served as a place for people to gather, share news, and support each other. Volunteers began to leave, but their presence had left lasting changes, training locals in first aid, disaster response, and community organization. The town now carried skills and confidence it had never had before. Evenings were quieter now, filled with conversation rather than cries for help. Families shared stories of courage and survival. People reflected on the way the community had come together, realizing that the disaster, as terrible as it had been, had revealed the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The teacher watched children play near the slowly repairing riverbank and felt a quiet satisfaction. They had faced fear, frustration, and chaos, and had learned that courage, compassion, and teamwork could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The town's recovery was not just physical but emotional. People learned to forgive moments of anger and frustration, recognizing that fear often brings out both the worst and best in people. Acts of bravery and kindness were remembered and celebrated, and the bonds formed during the disaster created a stronger, more connected community. Children grew up knowing that they had been part of something extraordinary, and adults learned the value of resilience and solidarity. By the end of the 6th week, the town had transformed. Streets were passable, homes were repaired, and the school and clinic were fully operational again. People had returned to routines, but they carried a new understanding. Life is fragile, nature is powerful, and humanity is strongest when it comes together in moments of need. Every act of help, every moment of courage, and every hand extended in kindness had left a mark. The flood had taken much, but it had also given something invaluable: the knowledge that when people unite, they can face anything. As the sun set over the town, reflecting off the repaired rooftops and calm river, there was a sense of quiet triumph. The disaster had been fierce, but the people had been fiercer in their courage and care for each other. Families were safe, children were smiling, and the community had learned lessons that would last a lifetime. And though the memory of fear remained, it was tempered by hope, gratitude, and the unshakable truth that when humanity responds, even the darkest times can be met with light. The town had survived the flood, but more importantly, it had grown stronger. The call for aid had been answered, courage had been shown, and compassion had flourished. From chaos and despair had emerged resilience and unity, and as people settled into the quiet of the evening, they carried with them the understanding that no matter what the future held, they had faced the storm together. And together, they could face anything.